Hello there and welcome back to the Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another project. Today I'll be delving into the giant green iridescent polyester shantung housecoat thing that I made for the recent Arcana lookbook. This thing is rather on the extra side, so I do hope you can forgive me. It includes some elements from the red robe I made last year, but I did add a hood, a ruffle, an extra long train, all kinds of different little details to this green number today, so we'd better go ahead and jump on over to the blue patterning table of doom and get started. And I did begin with the exact same pattern I used to make that red chiffon robe last year, so if you'd like to see me make this initial pattern, go ahead and click on this video. I will link to it here in a card to watch the red robe video where I make this initial pattern. I'm going to grab pieces out of here. I definitely want that same sleeve shape because, of course, it's epic and gigantic. But one of the biggest changes I'm going to make is I'm going to go ahead and cut this down the center front and just have this robe close at the center front instead of overlap at all, whereas the red robe has a bit more of a wrap-shaped front. This, I just wanted to be able to close it at the center front instead of wrapping one side over the other. And then that red robe did come out quite short, so I'm adding on a good, 10, 12 inches onto my initial pattern. You can see there it says 41 inches, and I usually make full-length skirts 46 inches on me, so you can see why that one was quite short. If anything, I wanted this one to be extra long, for the drama and the theatricality of it all, if not the practicality. Now the top of this does gather down into a yoke. I did gathering for the red robe. Today I'll be pleating this, and I'll show you that later. I don't necessarily have a pleating pattern that I was doing, so nothing is referenced on the pattern itself. I just pleated it down to the size I needed it later, and you will see that during the sewing process. Now I'll take the back piece here. This for some reason is separated. I don't remember why, but I'm going to go ahead and tape it back together. Now for the back, I basically just want to add more width into this. Now this is quite a lot to gather down into the back, especially if I'm going to connect the sleeves behind me like I did for the red robe again, which I end up doing. But because I want to add some large box pleats in the center back this time, instead of gathering, I wanted to add even more excess to put into those pleats. So that's what I'm going to do here. Honestly, I kind of wish I had made this even wider, but I might not have had fabric for that. But the more fabric you have to throw into your back pleats, the better. I'm sort of trying to mimic an 18th century sack back gown sort of style pleat in the back of this, and so I need plenty of room actually. You see I'm adding on about 3 inches at the center back, and then I just widen that as we get closer to the bottom. Flare it out a little bit more, because of course, the more of a train, the better. And I will add length onto this piece as well, just like I did for the front, so that it matches up with the side seam, and then dips down even further in the back here. But honestly, I could have added another 10 inches back here to really give myself plenty of room to do proper double box pleats like you see on the back of 18th century gowns. But for this, we're just kind of mimicking the idea as opposed to doing it exactly. But just loosely adding on some ease and a little bit of flair to this center back seam, and I can cut off my excess messy paper here. And let me add on that hem length here as well, just grabbing all my scraps of paper. I don't want to have to buy a new roll of alphanumeric before I move next year, so I'm trying to conserve paper a little bit more even than usual, so I'm using all my scraps and patchworking my paper together, so do forgive me for how messy these patterns end up looking, but it is more earth-friendly to use every scrap I've got. This piece already dips down into a bit of a train anyhow, so I'm just adding on the length to that, as much as I can eke out of all this extra paper really, so that it trails behind me as much as possible. Like so, and I am just going to indicate here on the side seam at the waist sort of level a 2-inch gap in the side seam, so when I sew the side seams shut, the backs to the fronts, I want to leave this open so I can fit a belt through the side seam. That way I can cinch the front and have the back still hang free. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab my 3-piece hood pattern out of this bag of hood patterns that I keep nearby. I made this pattern in this video, so you can see the creation of this hood pattern in this video. I will link in a card. And then I'll be finishing a lot of edges with bias today, so I'm using some of my green shantung here and a colored pencil and my ruler, of course, to create both 3-inch wide and 2-inch wide strips of bias that I can sew together and then create long bits of bias tape that I can turn into double fold bias tape or single fold bias tape in order to finish different edges of this robe today. I'll encase the front edges and collar in bias tape, as well as hemming the sleeves and the robe itself, all with bias, so super useful if you're not going to be lining anything, as a way to finish everything nice and cleanly. And of course I'm just drawing that on the 45-degree angle of the warp and weft, the 45-degree angle of the weave of the fabric, which is what bias is. But if you've been here before, you've seen me use a lot of bias to hem stuff before, so I shan't ramble too much. I will cut out some fusible interfacing for my front and back yokes as well, and then I can start putting my hoods together. I did cut out 2 hoods, so 2 center stripes and 4 hood pieces. 2 lefts, 2 rights, so that I can make a hood and then another hood to line it. So I'm just self-lining this. So I'll put 2 of these together. They will be identical. Just sew the first side to the center strip for both of these. Of course, you could use a contrast fabric. If you fully lined this sort of a robe, you could make something that was fully reversible as well, if you wanted to. It just would take a ton of fabric, because even this, I think this was 7 yards of this green shantung, which is why someone mistook this for silk, and I said, no, I promise this is polyester. I actually grabbed this fabric originally to make a curtain as part of the backdrop over on set, but didn't end up using it for that, and therefore I had a bunch of it to make a big curtain, and instead of a big curtain, I made a big housecoat, because why the heck not, honestly. If you have iridescent shantung laying around, whether it's silk or not, it has to be put to use. And for any of the edges that were going to be exposed inside of my robe, I did go ahead and run those through the serger real fast, just to protect these from fraying too much inside, because I will not be lining my robe today. And I will start seaming my bias strips together as well, so I can iron that into bias tape shortly. And over here on the machine, I'm just using my regular 12 stitches per inch and 1/2 inch seam allowance to sew this together. Regular all-purpose Gutermann thread. All my standard stuff over here on the machine. You can see I don't sew over these large pins, but any fine sewing pins. You will notice today that I will sew right over those buddies, because this fabric has no problem with that, and the machine certainly has no problem with that, so making it work. Some modern machines are more sensitive about pins, is what I've heard, which is probably why I get comments from people who learned to sew several decades ago saying they have no problem sewing over pins, and why I get comments from people who learned to sew within the last 10 years saying that they would never sew over pins and that I'm going to die one day doing so. So, you know, it's really up to you whether you want to take those risks, you know, and sew over your pins. Live life on the edge, as it were. But I've got my fusible interfacing on my yoke pieces now. You could also cut this yoke as a back and front all in one if you wanted to eliminate the shoulder seam. Just layer those pieces closed along the seam allowance of the shoulder seam, tape them shut, and you could have a yoke that just extends down and doesn't have a shoulder seam at all. Now the way I'm going to pleat the back down to fit this back yoke here, I'm going to pin the yoke basically to my ironing board, and I'll pin the body of the robe to the ironing board as well. So I've matched up the centers here, and I just am playing with the excess and pleating it down, using kind of 2 knife pleats towards the center back and then 1 towards the side. It's honestly more like knife pleats, I guess, than box pleats. I am box pleating this, but at some point, what is the difference, you know? Knife pleats towards the center and towards the side to look like a box pleat. Does that make sense? Let's hope so. Again, I'm not following a pattern. I'm just playing with this until it looks the way I'd like. This is not a functional pleat in any way. It's just here to look pretty, honestly. So just doing my best to make it look the way I'd like. But really, I think the tip here is to pin the back to the ironing board itself as you're doing this, so you know exactly how much excess you have to play with and pleat down, so you can replicate everything on both sides if you're trying to do something symmetrical like I am here. And again, on the red robe that I made last year, I did just gather all of this, which is another perfectly acceptable option as well for something like this. And once that's all in place, I can move my pins around that are holding the pleats in place and go ahead and sandwich the back yoke on those as well, right sides together. So this is ready to be sewn down, which will sew my pleats into place and sew my yoke to my back. And of course, this interfacing isn't the most attractive thing ever. The shantung is very thin. I honestly should have just used 2 layers of shantung and lined this area so that it wasn't just white interfacing on the inside, but clearly I didn't think of that at the time. This actually was one of the earlier projects that I put together for Arcana, before I was even going to call it Arcana, because originally I was going to call it Patina instead, like Verdigris, my last lookbook before this. But then things shifted as I was working on this collection of garments, I suppose. These long straight seams I'm pinning here are actually the top shoulder seams of my sleeves, my giant semicircle sleeves here. And while those were serged to protect the raw edges, I'm actually going to go ahead and encase the long raw edge that hangs, the edge of these sleeves that hangs along the body, I suppose. I'm going to go ahead and encase in double fold bias tape that I've made here, just because this sleeve is so long and so open that you could end up seeing this seam more often than the others as a part of this robe. So I wanted it to match the same color and kind of be a little bit more finished than the just serged seams I had elsewhere that were more hidden inside the robe. And you can always encase your raw edges in bias as well, or rayon seam binding is another really good option. And I will just clip the curves on my hood pieces before I give those a nice press, using the tailor's ham to help me press open the very curvy shape of this particular hood. I probably should have done the other giant hood that I used This was before I actually made those capes and other hooded cloak that I made earlier in the year, so I didn't have the giant square-shaped hood pattern made yet. Otherwise, I would have used that on this. I think this was the project where I said to myself, I really need a larger, more fantasy-looking hood pattern in my arsenal, and that's why I put together the other one in the cape video, and that's probably the style of hood I would use on something like this in the future. Always playing around with different hood shapes and learning more about what I like best, you know? But once both of those are together, the seams are trimmed, pressed open, and then top stitched actually into place just because this fabric is a little bit springy and I wanted it to stay smooth in here. I will go ahead and put one of these hoods inside the other, right sides together, and I can sew the front edge of this shut, kind of bag lining the hood, as it were. And I'm going to do a similar technique to pleat down the fronts of these into their front yokes, the front of the robe. And again, I'm just going to pin everything right to my ironing board while I decide exactly what I want here, just a couple of knife pleats to get this fullness down into this yoke. Like so, and I can go ahead and stitch that. Over here on the machine as well, this round, as I line my hood here as well. You can see on this fabric that it is a green cross-woven with a red, and that is why it has a little bit of an iridescent look to it. It's actually a bit of a spearmint-tinged, sort of minty Kelly green, mixed with a bright, rusty red, so that's what's going on with this fabric. It's not a very Christmassy green, which is always, of course, the risk with a red and green, but it's not too Christmassy, I think. I will go ahead and top stitch those pleats down as well, just to help everything stay smooth and hold everything into place a little bit extra here. And then I will go ahead and sew my shoulder seams, putting the fronts onto the back here. Again, you could eliminate this seam very easily. I don't know why I didn't bother. Again, this is future me judging past me. So, you know, I always see things that I can improve upon, naturally. We're all the most critical of our own work, are we not? Indeed. Give that a nice press here. Make everything behave. Now this hood pattern does have little darts in the back, but I'm just going to actually pleat those down today. Just put little tucks where those darts would normally be, just to keep that little bit of extra shaping without actually having to sew those 4 darts today. And here, if I lay my garment out, you can see on the right hand side is the front, on the left hand side here is the back. I will measure 11 inches out from either side of the shoulder seam, and that is where I'm going to connect my sleeve onto here, doing this top down in a very flat fashion. I do think I used this for a blouse on the channel before, so I will link to whichever blouse that was in a card here, where I might explain this a little bit further. It is kind of hard to understand, I think. It's actually simpler than having to set in a normal sleeve, I suppose, because you're doing everything flat like this. But because my sleeves and my garment are both rather rectangular in shape overall, I mean the sleeve is obviously rounded, but you could do it as a big rectangle, I'm just going to sew this on flat here, and then I will sew the side seam of the garment and the underarm seam of the sleeve separately here. So just line up that side seam. Of course, this is a very long side seam in this case. I'm going to do the same order of operations that I'm doing here on the other side of this garment as well, of course. So I'll go ahead and stitch that, and then I can do the underarm seam for the sleeve itself after I press this buddy open. There we go. Using my hands as a clapper, even though I have 2 wooden clappers nearby. That's right. As per usual, you're used to seeing me use my hands as a clapper. It doesn't work as well, but it is always right at hand. So sorry. But yes, lining up my underarm seam of my sleeve, that's the one that I put this bias on, just because these sleeves, again, are so flappy and large that it felt like a good area to have my seam be extra pretty, because it might be seen. Whenever your seams might be seen, you want to have nice seam scenes, I guess. So I went ahead and covered those in bias. And press that open as well. Nice and flat and prettily finished. And at this point, when I had both sleeves on here, I was thinking to myself, you know, this doesn't not look like a cheap polyester graduation robe at this point. Which maybe that's what this is. It's a graduation robe from some sort of PhD program in alchemy or other magical arts, that kind of thing. So now in my head, this is just a graduation robe from some sort of advanced alchemy program, and like all graduation robes, you're kind of like forced to purchase them and then never know what to do with them. So I figure, why not wear it around the house? So that's the story for this robe now. It now has a backstory. But I will go ahead and pin my hood on along the neckline and baste that in place. I will actually be encasing this in bias that goes along the front edge of the robe to encase the raw edges of the front, and this neckline back here as well. And I am using a 3-inch wide bias for that, which has been pressed into some double fold bias tape here, so the bias edge itself will finish at 1 inch, which gives me a little bit of almost a stand collar within the hood, which is nice, because we all know how I like a stand collar. But the neckline edge along the hood is curved, so I'll have to make sure I put some clips in there as I put this bias all along this front edge here. Then I will stitch that down, and I will actually top stitch that by machine as well to secure the other side of this. Could have done it all in one, honestly, but you know. Normally I sew one side by machine and then hand stitch the other side, but that would have been a very long seam at this point. And I was probably in the middle of making other things as well, because I had a lot of projects, a lot of irons in the fire at this point when I was working on Arcana. And I have had to slow down since, I'll tell you that much. I need my sewing mojo back, or sojo as it is called, because while I have a lot of ideas and I have fabrics lined up and stuff I want to make, as soon as I start sewing, it's like my body just slows down into like sludge. So I haven't made a ton since I finished all these projects for Arcana, but I've made a couple of things and I'm looking forward to getting back into the groove as soon as my brain and my body decide to cooperate and get me back in motion at full speed. Maybe that's just what happens when you push your engine a little bit too hard in the month of September and October, for example. But, you know, once again, so many ideas, so little time. But I guess I'll clip any additional curves that I need to, press everything to the inside, and I will just stitch that finished, clean, folded edge down into place over here on the machine. Just a heads up for those of you who have made it this far into the sewing process here, I'm probably not going to have a video out next week because it will be the week of Thanksgiving, and I'm actually going to be in California visiting my grandparents, so no video next week. I hope you can forgive me for taking a little bit of a holiday during the holiday. Not that it should be a holiday. I mean, giving thanks is nice, but we all know Thanksgiving's a bit fraught, to say the least. But I'm going to be visiting my grandparents in San Diego, so I will be out of town and away from the computer, which of course makes things rather impossible. But I might try and get up to the LA Garment District while I'm in California, so if I do, you will hear about it, that's for sure. I'm going to go ahead and hem the edge of my sleeves using this wide bias tape as well. This time, instead of using it as a double fold, I'll use it as a single fold of bias tape. And I'm actually turning this up out onto the outside so that this hem tape is kind of visible as a trim on the outside. So all the raw edges are being hidden in between, but instead of the bias being folded to the inside of the garment, I'm using it as an accent on the outside of the garment. And in an iridescent fabric, the bias and the straight grain look different when the light hits them, so I thought this would be a nice iridescent touch to have this on the outside of my sleeves. And you can see at this point, I have bandaged up my finger because I actually stabbed myself with my own scissors, because for any of you who ever think that I might have any amount of elegance, I can only do it when I'm editing the video and I can get the 20-second bursts of possible elegance, attempted elegance, all in a row, because in reality I am much more of a clumsy person, or bumbling at least, a little bit, unfortunately. I aspire to elegance, but it really is an act in my case. You know, I wish I could be elegant and glamorous all the time, but I am much more of a pajama gremlin who breaks a lot of glassware, and actually broke a pin dish in here in the sewing room this week, and that was unfortunate, so I'm going to tack the back of my sleeves together, just like I did for that red robe, and I'm going to add a nice green beaded tassel on right there as well, and then bead over my messy stitches where I tacked these together, just because I knew I was going to be beading over that, for a little bit of sparkle and a little bit of weight to this back, because again, this fabric is rather lightweight, so these sleeves are a bit floaty, and I wanted to give this a little bit of weight in the back here, which the tassel helps with, and so do these glass beads. As for these tassels, I did actually just make them out of this fabric to match, so I will show you exactly how I did that after I go ahead and hem the rest of this as well. So I'm going to use my double fold 2-inch wide bias tape here, which ends up as 1/2-inch bias tape. Once it's all pressed into place and folded up here, and I will use that to go ahead and hem the actual hem of this robe as well. So many areas are finished with bias. The front opening is finished with 1 inch wide bias tape. This bottom edge is finished with 1/2 inch bias tape. And the sleeves end up finished with a 2 inch wide bias strip. And again, before I get to my belt and tassels, I do want to add a big ruffle along the hem of this. So I'm just taking the rest of my fabric, cutting it into 18-inch wide strips as long as I can manage along the length of whatever fabric I had left over from making this robe. At least, you're going to want to double whatever the measurement of the bottom of your robe is, if not more, depending on how ruffly you want your ruffles. And I will go ahead and hem the long edges of this just by turning it a 1/4 inch twice and then stitching that down into place on the machine. And I'm actually going to gather this down by hand with a large, like almost bodkin kind of needle and some thick thread/yarn, aka embroidery floss, that I had laying around. So I'm just going to gather this by hand with these big giant stitches, 8 inches away from the first hem, which makes this around 10 inches away from the second. So when I stitch this down to the robe in a moment, the top of the ruffle will hang down and it will look like 2 tiers, even though it is only one large piece of fabric. So if you ever want layered ruffles, either you can make them the same length by gathering down the middle, or you can do it slightly asymmetric like this and they'll be gradated, so one ruffle is shorter than the other. I find it easier to use one strip of fabric and then gather it down the middle and let the top hang down. So you get 2 ruffles for the price of 1 here. And I gathered this all down by hand, and actually I put the robe on one of my display dress forms and just pinned the ruffle along the hem where I wanted it, because I wanted the ruffle to hang a little bit past the actual hem of the garment, just because I wanted this robe to be as dramatic and long as possible for the photo opportunity of it all. This is much more of a garment that I made for looks rather than practicality. Every once in a while I'll make something that's practical, but we all know it's rather rare. And I'll just finagle these ruffles into place a little bit extra with my fingers as I run this through the machine, stitching it down to the robe underneath. Now, in order to make custom tassels that match this fabric exactly, I'm going to go ahead and take the fabric apart. So I have a good, 20-inch by 14-inch piece of fabric here, and I'm pulling the threads apart so that I can grab these green, slubby green threads out of here. So I'm pulling the green threads out of my shantung here to use to make tassels. And once I have a big bundle of those, I'm going to go ahead and tie a piece of embroidery floss in the middle of this to start creating a tassel. It's a lot easier than you would think, honestly. So I've layered a little bit of metallic green embroidery thread in here as well, just to give this a little bit of sparkle. But otherwise, these are the exact same green threads that make up my fabric, and therefore a perfect match, technically. Although it looks a little bit different because it doesn't have that red cross weave in here anymore, and that's all an illusion of color. It's an optical illusion. I'm going to tie this together, and then I will wind some thread around to create a little like neck, I guess, for my tassel here, a little collar, and I'll tie that in a couple places, feed my thread up and down through this area just to hold everything at tension and keep everything in place. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and add some beads on as well, so there will be some additional tying going on here just to keep everything in place. And you can see the ends of the tassel are a mess, so I'm just going to hold it up to the first one and give that a nice quick haircut along the bottom. And now I have 2 perfectly matched tassels to add to the ends of my belt here. This again is just a very long strip of my fabric that I sewed into a little tube, pressed into place to create a belt for this. This belt is actually very long for this particular garment. But I'm going to go ahead and finish the ends of this just by pleating them and like kind of folding them into place and actually threading them right through the loop of this tassel, because why the heck not? And then I will stitch everything down nice and clean in the back so that everything is held into place and doesn't look too ridiculously messy. Though again, I'll sew on some beads in a moment to help give a little bit of weight to these tassels as well. This is what happens when I can't find tassels that match. I think, well, I haven't made a tassel, but I bet you it's not too difficult. It's just thread bundled up, right? Yeah. I'm going to grab some more of my green glass beads that I had here that I was using for the first tassel that holds the sleeves together. I'm just going to go ahead and bead on top of the embroidery floss that I used to create the collar for this tassel for a little bit of extra weight and sparkle. And lastly, I'll do a couple of fringes and glass beads as well for this. If I had a lot more time, I would go ahead and add more of these fringes because they are so fun and nice and sparkly. And it's a good thing I know how to make these tassels, because goodness knows if I do wear this around the house, my cats will end up attacking them and they may need repairs. here is my finished giant green shantung housecoat with its hood, with its multiple ruffle situation going on, and its fancy custom-made tassels that I'm sure my cats won't destroy the minute that they meet them. And again, what exactly are housecoats this dramatic for? I suppose sitting in a windowsill reading a book all day, as I say, or scaring the post people, and running after ghosts, crimson peeking it, as I like to call it. When it comes to the housecoats I've created over the years, it really is sort of about manifesting the kind of house that I want. I want some sort of weird haunted mansion-y place that's worthy of these housecoats, or vice versa. In any case, I hope you enjoyed seeing how this project came together today, and thank you as always for watching. I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye!